The clinking of silverware against plates was the loudest sound in the room, though the television murmured in the background with muted sports commentary. My father-in-law, Michael, was nursing his second glass of bourbon, his fingers tapping the glass rhythmically like a ticking time bomb. Laura sat across from him, her smile forced, her hand fidgeting with the edge of the napkin on her lap. Jake, my stepson, sat to my right, his face buried in his phone, his fork absently pushing peas around his plate. It wasn't an unusual sight, at least not at first glance. But the air was thick tonight, so thick you could cut it with a steak knife. "Is the chicken okay?" Laura asked, her voice a little too chirpy, like she was trying to break the tension with forced cheerfulness. She glanced around the table. "I tried a new marinade." Michael didn't answer right away. He took a long sip of his bourbon and stared at her with a hard, unblinking gaze. When he finally spoke, his voice was like gravel. "It's fine, Laura. Just like everything else." I paused mid-bite, the fork hovering inches from my mouth. His tone wasn't just dismissive, it was accusatory. Jake glanced up from his phone, his brows knitting together for a moment before he shrugged and went back to scrolling. Laura's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Well, I'm glad you like it," she said softly, though her voice was strained. I decided to interject, trying to clear the air. "So, Jake, how's school going?" Jake shrugged again, not looking up. Fine. Michael suddenly barked, slamming his glass down on the table. The sharp sound made everyone jump. "That's all you have to say?" "Fine." Jake finally looked up, his jaw tightening. "Yeah, fine? What's your problem, Michael?" "My problem?" Michael leaned forward, his voice low but seething. "My problem is this smug little attitude you walk around with. Like you've got it all figured out." "Michael," Laura said sharply, her voice a warning. "That's enough. Enough." He laughed bitterly, sitting back in his chair. "Oh, I think we've all had more than enough, haven't we?" His eyes darted between Laura and Jake, his lips curling into a sneer. Something was seriously wrong. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's going on here? Did I miss something?" Michael's gaze snapped to me, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something. Pity? Anger? Whatever it was, it made my stomach churn. "You didn't miss anything," he said, his voice tight. "You just haven't been paying attention." Laura shot him a warning look. "Michael, I swear." "You swear what, Laura?" He interrupted, his voice rising. "You swear you're going to keep playing house like nothing's wrong? Like we're all just one big happy family?" Jake stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'm not doing this," he muttered, shoving his phone into his pocket. "Sit down, Jake," Michael growled, his tone icy. Jake froze, his back stiffening, but he didn't sit. "This is ridiculous," Laura said, her voice shaking. "Michael, if you have something to say, just say it." Michael leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at me again, this time holding my gaze for a long, uncomfortable moment. "Oh, I've got plenty to say," he said finally, his words dripping with venom. "But I'm not sure he's ready to hear it." I felt the weight of his stare, the unspoken accusation in his tone. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Michael," I said, my voice low, "if there's something you want to say to me, say it. Enough with the cryptic comments." He smirked, shaking his head like I was a child who just didn't understand. "All right," he said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "You want to know what's going on? Fine. Let's clear the air." The room was dead silent except for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Laura looked like she wanted to bolt, and Jake was glaring at Michael with barely concealed hatred. Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times before sliding it across the table toward me. "Take a look," he said, his voice flat. I hesitated, my stomach churning as I picked up the phone. The screen lit up with a series of messages. Intimate, explicit messages between Laura and Jake. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I couldn't process what I was seeing. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking as I looked up at Laura. She paled, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Jake didn't say anything, but his defiant expression told me everything I needed to know. Michael leaned forward, his voice low and mocking. "It's exactly what it looks like. The garage was colder than I expected for a spring evening. I sat on a weathered stool next to Michael's tool bench, the sharp scent of gasoline mingling with the musty odor of old wood. The single overhead bulb flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across Michael's face. He leaned against his workbench, arms crossed, his glass of bourbon sitting untouched beside a pile of oily rags. I didn't want to be here, but Michael had cornered me after dinner. His demand was simple but non-negotiable. We need to talk. Now. I'd followed him out, my pulse pounding in my ears, knowing this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. What was that stun in there? I asked, trying to steady my voice. Michael didn't answer right away. He just stared at me, his eyes narrowing as though he were measuring me up, deciding how much I could handle. You really don't see it, do you? He said finally, his tone almost pitying. See what? I snapped. You've been acting like a lunatic all night. First at Laura, now at Jake. What the hell's your problem? He exhaled sharply through his nose, a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. My problem? You want to talk about my problem? Yes, I do, I said, trying to sound assertive, though my hands were gripping the edge of the stool, so tightly my knuckles turned white. He shook his head, chuckling bitterly. All right, let's talk about my problem. My problem is sitting across from me every damn Sunday, pretending he's just a college kid with his head in the clouds, while he's screwing my daughter-in-law behind everyone's back. For a moment, I didn't understand. The words didn't compute. They hung in the air, incomprehensible and surreal. What? I said dumbly, blinking at him. You heard me, Michael said, his voice low and biting. Your stepson, Jake, and your wife, Laura. They've been having an affair. God knows for how long. A laugh burst out of me before I could stop it. A sharp, bitter laugh that echoed off the walls. You're insane, I said, shaking my head. That's ridiculous. Michael didn't flinch. He reached into the pocket of his flannel jacket and pulled out his phone. With a few taps, he brought up a series of photos and messages, holding the screen out toward me. Take a look, he said flatly. I didn't want to look, but my hands moved on their own, taking the phone from him. The first thing I saw was a picture of Laura and Jake sitting way too close on our living room couch. Her hand was on his thigh, his face turned toward her in a way that made my stomach churn. But it was the messages that broke me. I can't stop thinking about you. Last night was incredible. What if he finds out? He's too stupid to notice anything. The phone slipped from my hands and clattered onto the concrete floor. My chest felt tight, and the edges of my vision blurred. This has to be a joke, I whispered, more to myself than to Michael. It's not a joke, Michael said, his voice cutting through the fog in my head. I wish to God it was, but it's not. I caught them. Last Tuesday. I looked up at him, my mouth dry. Caught them? What do you mean, caught them? He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face like he was tired of carrying the weight of this secret. I stopped by her place to drop off some tools. Walked in through the back door. Thought I'd surprise Laura. Maybe grab a beer with her. Instead, I found Jake with his hands all over her in your damn kitchen. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I doubled over slightly, sucking in a shaky breath. You're lying, I said weakly, though the conviction in my voice was gone. I wish I was, Michael said. Believe me, I wouldn't be here having this conversation if I wasn't absolutely sure. I stared at the floor, my mind racing, trying to reconcile the Laura I knew, the Laura who kissed me goodbye every morning, who curled up next to me every night, with the woman in those messages in Michael's story. How could she do this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Michael let out a bitter laugh. You really want me to answer that? Look, I'm not saying you're a bad guy, but Laura? She's the type who needs attention, validation. And Jake? He's just arrogant enough to think he can get away with anything. I felt a surge of anger rise in me, cutting through the numbness. Why the hell didn't you tell me sooner? Michael's face darkened. Because I wasn't sure how to tell you. And to be honest, part of me wanted to see if you'd figure it out on your own. But you didn't. You just kept walking around oblivious while they made a fool out of you. I shot to my feet, my fists clenched at my sides. Don't you dare put this on me. You think I wanted this? That I asked for this? Michael didn't back down. No, but maybe if you'd been paying attention. Shut up, I shouted, my voice echoing in the garage. Just shut the hell up. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension in the room was suffocating. Finally, Michael sighed, his voice softening. Look, I'm sorry. I know this isn't easy to hear, but you needed to know. You can't just keep living like this. I sank back onto the stool, burying my face in my hands. The images, the words, the betrayal, it was all too much. What am I supposed to do now? I asked, my voice cracking. Michael hesitated, then placed a hand on my shoulder. That's up to you. But if it were me, I'd make damn sure they regret it. I don't remember walking back into the house. My legs carried me through the garage door and into the kitchen as if on autopilot. The hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of the wooden floor the only sounds accompanying me. My chest felt tight, like it would explode if I didn't let something out. But the fury brewing inside me wasn't ready to boil over just yet. Laura was in the living room, sitting on the couch with a glass of wine in her hand. She had changed into her usual evening attire, sweatpants and one of my old college hoodies, the one I had given her when we first started dating. The sight of her in it turned my stomach. Jake wasn't far away, sprawled on the armchair with his phone still glued to his hand. The two of them didn't look like people carrying the weight of a dark, filthy secret. They looked comfortable, like nothing was wrong, like I was the one out of place. I stood in the doorway, staring at them for what felt like an eternity, my fists clenching and unclenching at my sides. Finally, Laura noticed me. Hey, she said, her tone casual, even warm. Everything okay? You and Michael were out there for a while. Jake didn't even look up. My mouth was dry, but I forced the words out. We need to talk. Laura's smile faltered, and she set her glass down on the coffee table. Okay, she glanced at Jake, then back at me. What's going on? Jake finally looked up, his brows furrowed as though my presence were some kind of inconvenience. Alone, I said, my eyes locking on Laura's. We need to talk. Alone. She hesitated, glancing at Jake again. That hesitation, just a split second, was all I needed to confirm what Michael had told me. The air in the room shifted, and my vision blurred with rage. Actually, you know what? I said, my voice shaking but growing louder with each word. Forget it. Jake should stay. In fact, Jake needs to stay. Jake straightened in his chair, setting his phone down. What the hell's your problem? Oh, my problem? I said, laughing bitterly as I stepped into the room. Let's talk about my problem. My problem is the two of you, sitting here like you're innocent, like you haven't been stabbing me in the back. Laura stood quickly, her face pale. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice high-pitched and shaky. Don't, I snapped, pointing a trembling finger at her. Don't you dare act clueless. Don't you dare lie to my face. Jake stood too, towering over me with that cocky, know-it-all smirk that I suddenly wanted to knock clean off his face. I don't know what Michael told you, he began, his tone dripping with fake calm, but he's just stirring shit up. You shouldn't. Shut up, I shouted, cutting him off. Don't you dare try to talk your way out of this. Laura's hands went to her face, her voice trembling as she spoke. I don't know what you think. I know. I bellowed, the words ripping out of me like a roar. I know about the texts, the pictures, the messages. I know about you too. Her face crumpled, tears springing to her eyes as she sank back onto the couch. It's not what you think, she whispered. Not what I think, I repeated, laughing bitterly. So, you're going to tell me what? That I imagined all of it? That Michael faked the proof? That I'm crazy? Jake crossed his arms, his jaw clenched. You're blowing this way out of proportion? That did it. I crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbing him by the front of his shirt. Out of proportion? I snarled, my face inches from his. You slept with my wife. He didn't flinch, his defiance only fueling my anger. You need to calm down, he said coldly. Laura leapt to her feet. Stop it, she screamed. Let him go. Let him go. I snapped, turning to her, but not releasing my grip. Why? So he can slink off to his room like the coward he is? So the two of you can figure out your next move? Well, guess what, Laura? There is no next move. This is over. Tears streamed down her face. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't mean for this to happen. I let go of Jake and turned to face her, my chest heaving. Didn't mean for this to happen? I repeated, my voice dripping with venom. So what, Laura? You just tripped and fell into bed with him? How long has this been going on? She didn't answer. How long? I shouted. 6 months, she whispered, her voice so quiet I barely heard her. 6 months. Half a year of lies. Half a year of betrayal. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My legs gave out, and I sank into the armchair Jake had been sitting in. Why? I asked, my voice hollow. Why would you do this to me? Laura dropped to her knees in front of me, her hands clasped together like she was begging for forgiveness. I don't know, she sobbed. I didn't mean to hurt you. It just happened. It just happened, I repeated, my voice flat. That's all you've got? It just happened? Jake, still standing, crossed his arms again. Look, maybe you should stop blaming her and take a good look at yourself, he said. I looked up at him, disbelief washing over me. Excuse me? You're not exactly husband of the year, he continued, his tone smug. You're distant. You don't pay attention to her. Maybe if you'd been a better partner. Before he could finish, I was on my feet again, my fist connecting with his jaw in one swift motion. The sound of the impact was satisfying, and he stumbled back, clutching his face. Stop it, Laura screamed, grabbing my arm. Don't you ever, I said, pointing at Jake as he regained his balance, ever try to put this on me? The room fell silent except for the sound of Laura's sobs and my ragged breathing. I looked at her one last time, my heart breaking as the weight of her betrayal finally sank in. I can't do this anymore, I said, my voice barely audible. I can't even look at you. Without another word, I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. I drove aimlessly for hours that night, my knuckles white against the steering wheel as the headlights illuminated empty streets. Every turn felt as aimless as my thoughts, but it was better than sitting in that house, with her sobbing in the living room and him nursing a bruised jaw upstairs. The anger simmered, but beneath it was something worse, an ache so deep it made me sick. 6 months. They've been doing this for 6 months, right under my nose. I replayed every moment, every kiss, every laugh we'd shared during that time, and now they felt like lies. By the time I pulled into the parking lot of a dingy roadside motel, exhaustion had dulled the sharp edges of my fury. I checked into a room with peeling wallpaper and a bed that creaked under the weight of my hopelessness. I stared at the ceiling until sunrise. When I got back to the house the next morning, the silence was deafening. My stomach churned as I stepped through the door, the stale smell of last night's dinner still lingering in the air. Laura was sitting at the kitchen table, her hair a tangled mess, her eyes swollen and red. She looked up when she heard me, but she didn't say anything. I ignored her and went to pour myself a cup of coffee, the mundane act grounding me for a moment. Where were you? She finally asked, her voice hoarse. Does it matter? I said flatly, not turning to face her. Of course it matters, she said, her voice breaking. I was worried about you. I laughed bitterly, turning to face her. Worried about me? That's rich, coming from you. She flinched, looking down at her hands. I know I screwed up, she said softly. I know I hurt you. Hurt me? I slammed the coffee mug onto the counter, the sound making her jump. You didn't just hurt me, Laura. You destroyed us. You destroyed everything. Her tears started again, but I didn't care. I couldn't care. Why am I demanded, my voice rising. Of all the people in the world, why my stepson? Why Jake? She shook her head, her hands trembling as she tried to find the words. I don't know, she whispered. It just happened. That's not an answer, I snapped. That's an excuse. Before she could respond, Jake appeared at the top of the stairs, his face still marked by the swelling from the punch I'd landed the night before. He didn't look sorry. He looked defiant, like he'd done nothing wrong. What are you doing here? He asked, his voice dripping with disdain. This is my house, I said coldly, meeting his gaze. Or did you forget that while you were screwing my wife? Hey, he said, holding up his hands, don't put this all on me. She's the one who. Don't you dare, I said, my voice low and dangerous. Don't you dare try to blame her to save your own ass. Laura stood abruptly, stepping between us. Stop it, she cried. Both of you, just stop. I took a step back, the rage bubbling up again. Oh, I'm sorry, I said mockingly. Is this too much for you? Is this not the life you imagined when you decided to blow up our marriage? Her face crumpled, and she buried her face in her hands. Maybe you should go, Jake said, crossing his arms as he leaned against the banister. I stared at him, incredulous. You think I should go? Yeah, he said, his tone smug. You clearly can't handle this like an adult. The words hit me like a slap, but they also snapped something inside me. Handle this like an adult? I repeated, my voice shaking with fury. Let's talk about handling things like an adult, Jake. Like sneaking around behind my back. Like lying to my face every single day. That's what you think adults do. He smirked, and I felt my blood boil. Get out, I said, my voice low and trembling with barely contained rage. What? Jake said, his cockiness faltering for the first time. You heard me, I said, stepping closer to him. Get out. You're not welcome here anymore. You can't kick me out, he said, his voice rising. This is my mom's house, too. I turned to Laura, my chest heaving. Tell him to leave, I said, my voice cold and commanding. She looked between us, her eyes wide and panicked. I can't, she whispered. Can't or won't? I demanded. She didn't answer. Fine, I said, grabbing my keys off the counter. If you won't make him leave, then I'm gone. Wait, she cried, reaching for me as I turned toward the door. Don't, I said, pulling away from her. Don't touch me. Her sobs followed me as I walked out the door, slamming it shut behind me. I spent the next few days at a friend's place, ignoring Laura's texts and calls. Every message was the same. Asterisk, please come home. We need to talk. I'm sorry, asterisk. But I couldn't bring myself to respond. Michael called me once just to check in. You doing all right? He asked. No, I said honestly. Good, he said. You shouldn't be. On the 5th day, I went back to the house, not because I wanted to, but because I needed answers. Answers Laura had refused to give me the first time. When I walked through the door, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Laura, I called out, but there was no response. I found a note on the kitchen table, scrawled in her familiar handwriting. I'm sorry for everything. Jake and I are leaving. I hope one day you can forgive me. The words blurred as my vision filled with tears. She'd made her choice, and now I had to make mine. The silence of the house was louder than anything I'd ever heard. I sat at the kitchen table for what felt like hours. Laura's note crumpled in my fist. The emptiness around me was overwhelming. Her perfume still lingered faintly in the air. Her favorite mug sat on the counter, and Jake's sneakers were by the door like he'd just come back from a run. But they were gone. The realization didn't come in one sudden burst. It crept up on me slowly, like a weight pressing on my chest. She'd left. Not just the house, but me. She'd chosen Jake over everything we'd built together. The anger wasn't as sharp now, dulled by exhaustion and disbelief. But beneath it was a smoldering ember, waiting to catch fire again. Michael showed up unannounced the next day, a 6-pack of cheap beer in one hand and a knowing look in his eyes. He didn't say much, just dropped the beer on the counter and pulled out a chair. They're gone, I said, my voice flat. I figured, he replied, cracking open a can and sliding it across the table to me. I stared at the beer, but didn't touch it. She left a note. I continued, my gaze fixed on the table. Said she was sorry. Said she hoped I could forgive her. Michael snorted. Forgive her? For what? Blowing up your life? Running off with your stepson? Yeah, that's a tough sell. I glanced up at him, his bluntness cutting through the fog in my head. Why do you even care? I asked. He took a swig of his beer, leaning back in his chair. Because I've been where you are, he said, his tone softer than I'd expected. Not the exact same situation, but close enough. Betrayal like that? It changes you. I didn't respond, but his words hit harder than I wanted to admit. The days blurred together after that. I went through the motions, work, eat, sleep, but everything felt hollow. I avoided the people who knew us, who'd ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. Laura and Jake didn't contact me, and I didn't try to reach out to them. Part of me wanted to, just to scream at them, to demand explanations, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. Then one night, about 2 weeks after they'd left, I got a call. The number was unfamiliar, but something compelled me to answer. Hello. I said, my voice rough from disuse. Is this Michael Carter? A woman's voice asked. This is, I replied cautiously. This is Officer Daniels with the Shelby County Police Department, she said. We need you to come down to the station. My heart skipped a beat. Why? What's this about? It's about Laura and Jake, she said. The drive to the station was a blur. My mind raced with possibilities. Had they been in an accident? Was one of them hurt? When I arrived, Officer Daniels met me in the lobby, her expression grim. She led me to a small, windowless room where another officer waited with a file folder. Mr. Carter, he began, we understand this might come as a shock, but we need to inform you that your wife, Laura Carter, has been taken into custody. What? I said, my voice rising. Taken into custody? For what? He opened the folder and slid a photo across the table. It was a grainy still from what looked like security camera footage. Laura was there, her face twisted in anger, holding what appeared to be a crowbar. She's being charged with aggravated assault, the officer said. She attacked Jake Willis 2 nights ago. The room tilted, and I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. What? I whispered. The officer nodded. It appears there was a dispute between the two of them. Witnesses reported hearing shouting before Mrs. Carter struck Mr. Willis multiple times. He's in the hospital, but stable. I stared at the photo, my mind racing. The image of Laura, the woman I'd loved, the woman who'd betrayed me, morphed into someone I didn't recognize. Why? I asked, my voice barely audible. That's what we're hoping you can help us figure out, the officer said. Over the next few days, the story unfolded in bits and pieces. Laura and Jake had moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. At first, things seemed fine, or so the neighbors said. But then the fighting started. It didn't take long for their honeymoon phase to disintegrate. Jake's arrogance and Laura's guilt created a volatile mix, and the arguments escalated until they culminated in the attack. I visited Jake in the hospital once, not because I wanted to, but because I needed closure. He looked small in the bed, his face pale and bruised. What are you doing here? He asked weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, I admitted, standing at the foot of the bed. He didn't say anything, just stared at the ceiling. You ruined everything, I said after a long silence. But you didn't win. Do you understand that? He closed his eyes, turning his face away. Laura's trial was short. She pled guilty, and the judge sentenced her to probation and mandatory counseling. I didn't attend, but Michael did. She looked like hell, he told me afterward. But she didn't make excuses. I'll give her that. Months passed, and life slowly began to piece itself back together. I sold the house and moved to a new city, leaving behind the ghosts of what once was. Sometimes I catch myself thinking about them, wondering where they were, if they'd learned anything from the destruction they'd caused. But those thoughts became less frequent with time. In the end, their betrayal didn't define me. It changed me, yes, but it didn't destroy me. And that was enough. The letter came on a quiet Saturday morning, plain and unassuming. Inside was a single note. Meet me at the diner on 6th. Tomorrow. Noon. There was no signature, but curiosity drove me to show up. When Jake walked in, I nearly left. He slid into the booth across from me, his face thinner, his posture defeated. What do you want? I asked coldly. I need to tell you something, he said, his voice unsteady. Laura, she used me. I laughed bitterly. That's your excuse? He shook his head. No excuse. Just the truth. She hated you, Michael. She wanted to hurt you, and I was stupid enough to let her. His words left me frozen. I didn't know if I believed him, but when he slid an envelope across the table, I opened it later. Inside were messages, darker than the ones I'd seen before. He'll never suspect. This is what he deserves. They told a story of not just betrayal, but calculated malice. Laura hadn't just strayed. She'd plotted to ruin me. I burned the messages that night, watching the flames consume the last remnants of her cruelty. The truth hurt, but it also set me free. She hadn't won.